We have with us today Prabir Purkayastha, who is the founder editor of NewsClick.
I would like to place before you that the external policies of the country are not independent of the internal policies. In some sense, they are really reflections in international affairs, what we are doing also internally. And if we look at India's foreign policy, and I'm going to take a little more, shall we say, broader view of what the current foreign policy is all about, I'll start by saying if you look at India's foreign policy, it was a reflection of two things. It was a reflection of the anti-imperialist struggle, the anti-colonial struggle, which the Indian forces, the nationalist forces that we talked about had waged, which wanted an inclusive India and therefore also projected a foreign policy which was anti-colonial and was in that sense a part of the decolonization movements taking place all over the world. That was a solidarity. It was not a solidarity of just simply a non-alignment in which certain countries came together, but non-alignment movement had underpinning it this national struggles which had taken place in different parts of the world, India being one of the earlier ones which got its freedom, but the decolonization process continued till even up to the 60s. And even today, let's not forget, we have one country which is still an occupied country, which is Palestine. So British colonialism earlier, who hands it over to settler colonialism of Israel, and now it's still, after such a long period, it's still essentially a colonial outpost of essentially, as we said, settler colonialism. But if you take all of it, you will see that India's foreign policy was built upon not aligning with the imperialist blocs, not aligning with the Soviet Union, the socialist bloc, but also aligning with the decolonization process, and that was central to India's foreign policy. Of course, it weakens over time, just internally as it weakens in India, that you see forces which earlier held together the country, saying that the independence of India must deliver results not just for small sections but the entire people. As that weakens, as the fruits of the national movement come to those sections which are able to grow at the expense of others, as the fruits of development become disproportionate, you have also shift in foreign policy. Its entanglements with global capital means it comes closer and closer to international capital. And that is what one of the elements that you see of internal policies being reflected, that clear anti-colonial positions of decolonization become more and more muted. And you start looking into quote-unquote non-alignment as being something which you don't really have to be aligned to any specific view, including the national movements, anti-colonial movements. Therefore, our shift most clearly in the case of Israel and Palestine, where we start talking about Israel and Palestine being both our friends and not just Palestine being an occupied territory, West Bank being something which needs to be freed from the occupation of Israel. We start giving lip service at the same time we start coming closer and closer to Israel. Now, there is one fundamental difference between this kind of shift that we see and the current shift we are seeing. And it must be very clearly understood again that India's foreign policy has not been, over the last 20, 25 years, as unilinear as some of our friends seem to think. They think, okay, Congress did this, the BJP is doing it, what's the difference? And I think there is a significant difference that I have to place before you. The significant difference is when the Congress starts losing its, shall we say, anti-colonial moorings and starts sacrificing the larger vision of what kind of India it should be. I'm not calling it a socialist vision, but at least it had the vision that the public sector commands what's called the commanding heights of the economy. And therefore, it's for public good that we have to bring the state certain state resources that have to be made available to everybody, whether it's education, whether it is public sector, it's road, it's infrastructure, electricity, and so on. When you have that as a vision, which I once heard P.N. Huxer say, that we were trying to reduce the dissonances and increase the consonances in Indian society. So it is in some sense trying to mute the underlying class struggle which existed with a very large state intervention. We're using the public sector to build certain public goods, including education. That is only one part of it which you see the Congress itself moving away from. But what is important to register, that Congress, irrespective of what it did or what it didn't do with respect to minority rights and so on, it was always taking for granted the minorities are going to vote for the Congress, because after all the option was the BJP and or the Jana Sangh earlier, and that for the Muslims was an unacceptable option. So this kind of positions that were there did not mean that the Congress in that sense had any vested interest of actually marginalizing any specific community. It had a specific re-argument of building a certain kind of capitalism which shifts in post-1990 towards what's called the neoliberal model, in which you talk about, as Manmohan Singh did, about what is it, the animal spirits of capital, which is really loot, plunder on a mass scale using the state, which is what we saw during the 2G scam and various other scams beside. One part of that continuity is, of course, as we see the Rafale scam, where Anil Ambani, the beneficiary of 2G, is also the beneficiary of the Rafale deal. But there's one significant difference, that BJP or the Jana Sangh has its philosophy in external policy centered around what it believes as the unity or the alliances of religious identities of different kinds. I was in jail during emergency, and most of my fellow inmates were really from the right, because their numbers were quite large, and it was also the RSS as well as the Jamaat Islam, smaller numbers. Now, there was a very interesting thesis that I heard, and pardon my ignorance, I wasn't so aware of what they were saying at that time, that we want a unity of the Hindus, the Christians, and the Jews against Muslims and the communists. This was actually the foreign policy articulated by the RSS right post-independence, that is the kind of unity we want. Therefore, the United States, therefore in West Asia, it's Israel. And who are our enemies? Our enemies are the socialist countries at the time in the 40s, that was an important issue, and of course the Muslims, 1.2 billion of them. So this has been the other part of the foreign policy. So not just simply an alignment with Indian big capital, which we see as its continuity with the Congress, but the discontinuity is that it is not just aligning with imperial capital, it also sees itself as a partner to white nationalism of the Trump variety, which also talks about the Christian white races. And this whole argument of identities as white, as ethno-nationalism, identity as religious identity, of Christian identity, and of course the Jewish identity and the Hindu identity coming together in terms of a foreign policy. Now the problem with the Indian Foreign Office is that actually neither understands or even is able to implement this kind of foreign policy, because it is not a foreign policy of even the imperial powers. Nobody else, including Israel, believes in this. They believe in actual occupation of the Palestinians. Trump believes that that's the alignment that he has to do. It's Islamophobia. And of course, with America first, he's willing to forget about the rest of the world. They should pay rent for the military armaments that he provides, and should pay rent for protecting them against various forces. His is a very simple logic of the mafiosi, that you pay me protection money. He's saying it vis-a-vis the NATO. We are protecting Europe. Where is our money for giving this protection? So those kinds of philosophies is now combining in India with this extremely regressive politics internally of what we already see, which the other speakers have talked about, is merging with this ethno-nationalism, religious identity politics, which says that it is not simply just aligning with imperial capital, but it is also aligning with white nationalism, with Christians, with Islamophobia, and with, of course, Zionism. That's what Israel really is a Zionist state. If we see, therefore, that this kind of views, what it does to India's foreign policy, is India at the moment is a complete outlier in foreign policy. Apart from South Asia, it's not able to maintain even any independent existence. If you take, for instance, the main currents of global struggles today, it's very clear that from G77, though there has been a fragmentation, that you have what is to be called the third world, the developing countries, splitting into emerging economies, not so developed countries, and so on. But the kind of unity that existed against imperial capital, which is what the WTO negotiations, the various trade negotiations, the military occupations, the various wars of occupations, which we saw Iraq, we see in Africa today, the policies of failed states, which is what the policy of global capital in retreat is now showing us, that they are not able to control those states, they can capture them. Iraq was captured in about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Afghanistan in a week, the American army had been able to come in with the Northern Alliance into Kabul. But to control them is not possible. British colonialism could control these countries. They were colonialism at an ascendancy. These imperial capital that we see today, the United States, can break countries very easily but cannot control them. So you see, therefore, the kind of alliances that have been built over the 30, 40 years out of the decolonization struggles, which had kept colonial, ex-colonial powers and imperialism, particularly led by big imperial power United States, which claimed after 1990 the sole global hegemon. This, as you see, India's weight in this is almost non-existent. Why? Because we have aligned with this vision of India being a part of Islamophobic world. We have aligned with the vision of our being a junior partner of the United States. Therefore, we have no voice in West Asia, which is really not very far from us. It also makes sense if you see the other problem that the RSS has, that its basic texts is really Arthashastra in everything. And therefore they can't get beyond, the rings, that every country around him are enemies, the countries after that are friends. Now that takes you as far as Afghanistan. It doesn't take you further than that. So therefore India's foreign policy is almost entirely in the near India vision. It doesn't go beyond that. So they do not know, or the Indian Foreign Office, which understands foreign policy, does not know that what this government wants, because they really have no role in any other space except Pakistan and China. So it's become almost entirely a Pakistan and China-centric foreign policy. Everything else, India says, we are going to say exactly what we said earlier, whatever that statement means. This is what they said about Palestine when Trump declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Indian government said, we stand by our old policies. What those old policies are, they said no comment. Now, this is the kind of foreign policy we now have, that we have no comment except when Pakistan something happens, or Doklam something happens on the borders. So our foreign policy is entirely related to our borders. It stretches a little more in the oceans. We are up to the Malacca Strait, because that is where the United States want us to contain China. So we have extended our border on the sea up to Malacca Strait with Japan, Australia, and United States. I'm going to leave that for Atul, so I'm not going to encroach on his territory. But what is happening is Indian foreign policy for the first time is not a global foreign policy. Except for Modi going on global visits, there's no global vision in these policies. And this is unfortunate, because India, whatever it is still recognized on the global stage as the country which speaks for the global south. And that is the real tragedy in the world today, that a country which was recognized when it was probably something like 30th or 40th in the GDP per income of a country, GDP of a country, which was at that time accepted as one of the major players in foreign policy, was accepted in the global space that India could intervene on any of the disputes which are taking place globally. That recognition came because it was aligned to a whole number of countries and people whose aspirations was freedom from colonialism, freedom from imperial bondage. And that is what gave India its so-called stature, it gave it its moral authority. Today, having gone into Arthashastra and this kind of, shall we say, sterile policies based on identities which have no future, it didn't even have a past. With that, we have not only lost that stature, but we have nothing to say, because these kind of formulas, which Mr. Modi believes in, he always gives, when he speaks, formulas. Now, formulas don't give a policy. Now, formulas may at best solve a limited problem. That's what we know in mathematics. It does not tell you what is the way to solve problems. And therefore, what we see is a foreign policy which has completely lost its way, which at the end of it is tying itself to the two most destructive powers in the world, one of which is United States, which has probably a record after 47 of invading something like 60 or 70 countries, actual physical invasions. And then Israel, which has in the last 40 years, 50 years, has attacked n number of countries and holds the last official colony in the world, namely West Bank, Palestine. Now, with that, I will say that we have really come to a position that India's position in the world is probably at the lowest in terms of foreign policy, and except Modi's suits, nothing really shines in India's foreign policy. Thank you very much.